Donald Trump's first foreign trip as U.S. president. He says the five-stop tour has historic significance. How will his trip shape U.S. foreign policy? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Dareen Abughaida. So Donald Trump came to power promising an America First foreign policy. On his first trip abroad as U.S. president, he's expected to clarify what the America First policy means for U.S. allies. The first stop on his tour of 5 countries is Saudi Arabia. Trump was greeted by King Salman in Riyadh. He'll be holding talks with other leaders in the course of the coming 9 days. Many argue that this trip will shape the U.S. foreign policy under Donald Trump's administration. So Trump's next planned tour stop is Israel to meet Israeli and Palestinian leaders. Trump's appointment of an ambassador with pro-settlement views is controversial, and he's made contradictory statements on the status of Jerusalem. Both Israelis and Palestinians say the city will be the capital of future independent states. He'll also be meeting with the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. Now, Trump will then meet Pope Francis at the Vatican. The Roman Catholic leader has made clear his opposition to Trump's views on immigration and climate change. The U.S. president's expected at a NATO summit in Belgium. Trump described the military alliance as obsolete during his election campaign. Since then, he's been urging members to pull their weight and increase their financial contributions. Well, Trump is due to end his tour in Sicily for a summit of G7 leaders. They'll be keen to hear Trump's policies on trade, fighting ISIL, and the Syrian refugee crisis. Let's bring in our panel. From Riyadh, we have with us Joseph Kechichian. He's a senior writer at Gulf News. In Brussels, Kristine Berzina, a transatlantic fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And from the United States, from Washington, D.C., we're joined by Mark Jacobson. He's a former advisor to the Defense Secretary Ash Carter. He's also now a visiting professor at Georgetown University. Welcome to you all. So a lot of news to unpack in this 30-minute program. Mark Jacobson, Trump is tweeting this before he took off on Air Force One. Getting ready for my big foreign trip. We'll be strongly protecting American interests. That's what I like to do. What is the message that Trump is sending out by starting his first foreign trip in Saudi Arabia?
Well, I don't think it's a great one. You take a look at Saudi Arabia, that's the home to most of the 9/11 hijackers. That certainly doesn't send a signal to the majority of Americans that he's putting America first. I think the signal that the American people have gotten since January, and really since last year during the campaign, is that Trump puts Trump first. So I think what we're going to see over the next week or so is a set of messages that's probably more important for the Middle Eastern and European audiences in terms of all the questions, the inconsistency on Russia and NATO, the inconsistency about the Israeli-Palestinian issues, and even inconsistencies in terms of overall U.S. policy in the Middle East.
Well, we'll be asking whether these inconsistencies are, in fact, going to be changed to more consistencies. I'll ask you that in just a moment, Mark Jacobson. But Joseph Kechichian, over to you in Riyadh. Just weigh in on the significance of Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia.
Well, the visit in Saudi Arabia will be probably the best 2 days on this trip because the Saudis are putting out the double red carpet to welcome him, to reiterate once again the strategic ties between the two countries, notwithstanding 9/11. There is a new administration in place. The Saudi experience with the predecessor, Barack Obama, was nefarious, to say the least. Therefore, there is an opportunity to open a new page. And of course, there are mutual interests at play here. And the Saudis are doing everything that they can to win over Mr. Trump in order to make sure that the debate that is underway right now in the Muslim world is not something that is turned against the United States, but to be able to work together.
But isn't this surprising, Joseph, in the wake of his America First rhetoric, as we're saying, and also campaign statements calling for that Muslim ban, as you know, backed by orders attempting to limit travel from some Muslim-majority countries?
Of course it is. It doesn't mean that Trump is going to succeed because he has so much trouble at home. But I think that notwithstanding the fact that Mr. Trump is in political trouble in the United States, nevertheless, there is a new relationship that is now unfolding with Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Muslim world. The rhetoric of the campaign is no longer valid in the eyes of Saudi officials, and they're trying to work out some kind of a new modus vivendi to essentially not only make America great once again, but also to ask the United States to behave like a superpower once again. That's a big difference, I think, in the opinion of many people here.
Kristine Berzina, historically, as my guests are saying, there's been a close security relationship between the U.S. and Gulf countries, and specifically when it comes to Saudi Arabia. Now, what we understand is Trump is expected to lay out some sort of vision for a new regional security alliance, an Arab NATO, as it's being dubbed by some, and also to announce $100 billion arms sales to Saudi Arabia. So what does this tell you about the direction that he's taking his foreign policy in when it comes to this region specifically?
It's clear that there are a few consistencies in Trump's foreign policy. One of them is his desire to address terrorism. Counterterrorism as a priority is how he wants to address Europe. It's how he wants to address the Gulf. It's how he wants to address Russia and also partners in the East. And so when you see that this is how he's going to be approaching his first foreign trip, that he is speaking about security, he is proposing this big arms deal in Saudi Arabia, and then following with these visits in Europe, including to NATO, it is clear that the conversations he will be having are going to be security-focused, defense-focused, and pragmatic in addressing terrorism.
Mark Jacobson, Kristine bringing up the word consistency there. That's something that you had disagreed with right at the top of the program. But when it comes to fighting ISIL, for example, and quote-unquote what's described as terrorism, does she have a point that he has been consistent, in fact?
In some ways, I think Kristine's right. I mean, you take a look, and especially with Secretary Mattis outlining a new, and I would even say more aggressive U.S. strategy versus ISIL, there is some consistency. But here's the problem. $100 billion arms deals are not what's going to defeat ISIS. Trump can't decide whether he wants U.S. troops on the ground and potentially getting into another quagmire in Syria, or whether he wants to disengage. And I actually think this is my concern. That he's very transactional and responding to the problem of the week or the problem of the day, and we're not going to get a consistent and a coherent strategy. For example, even in Secretary Mattis's comments yesterday, he spoke about annihilating ISIS, annihilating them through kinetic military action, when we know that you cannot kill an idea with a bullet. So what's the overall strategy? I'm a bit skeptical that Trump's visits to Saudi Arabia and to the Vatican, and again, with the G7 and with NATO, is really going to create some sort of grand unified approach by the world's three major Abrahamic faiths, and that we're going to see peace break out with an Arab NATO. I'm very skeptical about that, and I'm very concerned that he's being reactive and transactional, and we won't see a coherent approach to dealing with violent extremism.
What about, is there a strategy, Mark Jacobson, when he is taking with him not only a team of advisors, as you know, but also traveling with him are dozens of U.S. business leaders, including the heads of some of the major companies, and Trump himself will be meeting with dozens of Arab and Muslim leaders from across the region.
Yeah, something Joseph said earlier I think sticks with me, and that is that the first part of the visit is going to be the easiest. I don't have a problem with the President of the United States bringing business leaders. In fact, I think that's a great idea. I just worry about his overall approach. Is the U.S. interest in the Middle East solely about business relationships? And again, this gets back to the idea of America first. Well, what about American values? What about what America stands for in the world? What about 100 years of internationalism that have really created the stability and the security under which Trump's father was able to thrive and therefore hand to his son this great inheritance? You know,
are you saying that this is all at risk now?
What gives U.S. the power?
Are you saying that this is at risk?
I do think it is all at risk.
Kristine, do you agree with that?
Yes, I do
think
it is at risk.
I think there is a lot at stake this week, and a lot is at risk in terms of America's role internationally and the future of the international organizations that we rely on for collective security. There's a big question here in Brussels in advance of Thursday's leaders' dinner at NATO about whether there will be a a common productive conversation on security, or whether there will be a stray tweet or a comment that will undermine the peace and security that everyone values, especially at a time when really in Europe there hasn't been, there's a moment of an unprecedented security risk. When you look south and you look at Syria, look at Libya, when you look east, still the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and the unresolved situation with Russia, it is a moment for the transatlantic community to come together and to agree on values and to agree on measures and approaches for addressing these challenges. And when you go into that situation without clear guidance from the United States, whether the values are on the same page and whether there is even true backing for the institutions, then it is a moment in which we're at risk.
All right, so we'll be delving a little bit deeper into NATO in just a moment, but just back to what he'll be doing in Riyadh. Joseph Kechichian on Sunday, some saying the most striking or perhaps questionable, as others describe it, depends how you look at it, will be his speech that he will be giving about Islam. What do you expect there?
Well, he has three major objectives here. We touched on two of them so far, but we haven't touched on the third. The first one, of course, is the projected arms sales of $100 billion over a number of years. But I would like to remind our listeners that the previous administration, the Obama administration, sold approximately $115 billion worth of weapons between 2009 and 2015. So this is nothing new. This is something that will continue along the same way. We also talked about terrorism and the fact that the president, during the campaign, had or said that he had a great plan to deal with ISIS. So far, we don't know what that plan is. Presumably, he will work something out with the delegations that are present here to figure out how to handle this problem as a collective effort, not just the American effort or Western effort to deal with this very serious question. And then the third agenda item is to actually give a talk on Islam. Unfortunately, the writer of this particular speech is Stephen Miller, who unfortunately happens to be the individual who came up with the brilliant idea of having the Muslim ban at the beginning of the term almost 4 months ago. We don't know exactly what he's going to say in the next few hours. We'll find out. But it seems to me that from the Saudi perspective and the Arab Gulf states perspective, the good thing is that Trump is here, and everyone is expecting that this speech will be very different from the one that Obama gave in Cairo in 2009. Namely, not to promise the world, not to promise everything under the sun, but to actually have a dialogue going on between the different communities around the world in order to improve stability and the regional peace. I don't know whether he will be able to accomplish this, but we will wait and see.
Mark, after Saudi Arabia, he'll move to Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. Now, even before he's gotten there, Israeli media reporting, quote, chaos in the preparations of his visit. And the former U.S. ambassador to Israel, I'm sure you know him, Martin Indyk, tweeting that Israeli mood has been soured by the Masada speech cancellation, 15 minutes at a museum, and refusal to call the Western Wall Israel or the move the embassy to Jerusalem. What do you think of all of that happening right before he gets to Israel?
Now, I think former U.S. Ambassador Dan Shapiro put it best. When an American leader goes to Israel, every word, step, and gesture is overanalyzed. And Trump's really already kind of set a very bad stage for himself before getting over there. Only a 15-minute visit to Yad Vashem. I mean, this is the mandatory visit for leaders when they come to Israel. I do think there's a possibility here, an outlier, that there could be a little bit of progress made in terms of getting Abbas and Netanyahu together. But I think that would be a tough call even for a Bill Clinton, George Bush, or Barack Obama. I'm not quite sure Trump can do it. So my measure for success for this part of the trip will be no major international diplomatic incidents, no major mistakes, and anything above that I'll consider success.
Joseph Kechichian, what would be your measure of success? And do you agree with what Mark is saying, that he possibly can get Abbas and Netanyahu to move along somewhat on, what's called as the so-called peace process?
Well, making a deal in the Arab-Israeli conflict does not resemble making a deal in a real estate property in New York City.
He's referred to this deal as the ultimate deal, in fact.
Well, perhaps it is the ultimate deal, but he has to deal with the refugee situation, what's going to happen to them, the status of Jerusalem, as we spoke a moment ago. And more importantly, it's not just sufficient to speak with Abbas and to talk with Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Abbas, but to also figure out whether or not the United States is going to talk with Hamas as well. You cannot just ignore a good portion of the Palestinian population that are party to whatever negotiations are going to occur. So therefore, I think the president's work is cut out for himself in Israel. In fact, I would wager to say that the stop in Jerusalem in Israel will not be as scot-free as people assume. He will have a lot of problems dealing with the Israeli public opinion, especially since we know that allegedly the Russians have gotten some secrets about what's going on in Syria. The intelligence came from Israel itself, so the Israelis will be very upset with Trump and will take the opportunity to remind him that those kinds of issues are not to be taken very lightly.
Kristine, can you weigh in on this and just tell us what you think will be the outcome of his trip to Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories?
President Trump is going to have his hands full to address address Israel right now, specifically because of this scandal last week in Washington, when it became clear that President Trump was sharing intelligence that was likely from Israel with Russian counterparts, with Foreign Minister Lavrov. The basis of trust between Israel and the United States is an incredibly important pillar of American foreign policy. And that needs to continue as far as most congressional officials are concerned, as far as most of the administration is concerned, and allies in Israel. It will be up to President Trump to prove that to his audience at home and to Israel while he is there. And that is even before addressing the many complicated issues between Israel and the Palestinians. And so, again, he's going to be in very hot water, and how he's going to navigate it, it's going to be a real challenge.
Mark Jacobson, you know, it's hard to ignore what's being described as the symbolism, right? When President Trump goes from Saudi Arabia onto Israel and occupied Palestinian territories, and then moves on to the Vatican. So how symbolic is his trip to the Vatican and him holding an audience with the Pope?
I actually think with most other world leaders, this would be more symbolic. I mean, I can't think of anyone less pious and less respectful of the tenets of major religious faiths than Donald Trump. I mean, we're talking about he's already angered Pope Francis. We're actually going to see in the United States students at Notre Dame do a silent walkout of Vice President Pence based on the administration's treatment of refugees. So while people may wish to see symbolism in here, I think from a practical standpoint, I'm concerned that the president is going to embarrass the nation and is more likely to offend all three Abrahamic faiths within the course of a week.
Kristine, you were mentioning NATO just a moment ago, and you know, it's an organization that President Trump has referred to as being obsolete in the past, and you brought up some of the concerns that NATO partners have, especially when it comes to Russia. So a question with two parts. What are these countries looking for Trump when he arrives in Brussels, and what is Trump tangibly going to be able to provide, in your opinion?
When Trump comes to Brussels, everyone in Brussels is hoping that he doesn't burn the city down. That he doesn't undermine the institutions that are based here. The meetings in NATO are very important to show from President Trump himself that the alliance is not obsolete. And President Trump will be seeking from NATO to see clear steps about how NATO is useful for the fight against terrorism, and from the allies themselves, how they will increase their spending to give the U.S. a better deal, a more fair deal, as he would probably put it. This is the question about burden sharing and about whether member states are paying 2% of their GDP towards defense. So these are the questions that are going to be on the table. These are questions that are ongoing, and I don't think will be earth-shattering. What would be earth-shattering is a comment about the lack of value of NATO for the United States. This is something that people fear here. It is worrying to me that the Brussels part of his trip is stop number 4 on a very long trip. We know that heading to Saudi Arabia this morning, President Trump did not sleep much on the plane. He is already tired. He's going to be jet-lagged. He will have had many meetings. And as we said, he will have had challenges to look at already in Israel. Probably a not very friendly meeting with Pope Francis before he comes to Brussels, and where he has to deliver really a message of good faith to his partners. Will he have the stamina to do that? That is something that all of us in Brussels are worrying about right now.
That is something that we
will he have the stamina?
We will have to wait and see.
Yes,
but,
yes.
You know, you talk about stop number 4, but Joseph Kechichian, stop number 5 is then Italy, and Sicily in particular, in the G7 summit. So that is where he is capping his trip. Now, his rhetoric on the campaign trail and certainly before the election was quite protectionist. What's the G7 alliance going to be looking for, and what is Trump going to be able to provide?
Since you can no longer separate military affairs from economic affairs, the stop in Italy will, to a certain extent, depend on what happens in Brussels. If, in fact, the German-French machine that is now back into track is very strong in Brussels, I think it will have an impact in the G7 meeting in Italy. And I think that the president will find that his audience members will require a great deal of persuasion to go along with the trade policies that he is proposing. Now, does it mean that Mr. Trump is not going to be able to work some kind of a deal with the G7 countries? He probably will be able to recuperate some of the losses that he will have between Israel and the Vatican and Brussels. But nevertheless, I think that don't underestimate his ability to persuade as much as possible the G7 leaders to come abroad, but a great deal of it depends to come on board, but a great deal of it depends really on Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron.
Emmanuel Macron, who we understand he will probably be meeting as well. But Mark, you know, he's obviously dealing with and confronting a lot of serious issues on this trip during the course of his 9 days. Is there a sense in the United States that this could help realign him, reset the president himself, seeing that he's in a bit of a weakened position at home?
I think traditionally that's what you'd see out of a foreign visit. What a good time for the president to get out of town, facing scandal at home, facing, you know, again, a new a re-enhanced FBI investigation. I don't think that's going to happen. As I said earlier, I think the messages to the European audiences are going to be slightly different than what the U.S. audience takes away. I think the U.S. audience is going to remain focused on the scandal. I think with the upcoming Senate Intelligence Committee hearing that will feature a public appearance by former FBI Director Comey, the focus of the American public and the American media is going to be largely on what happens in the U.S. Congress. Now, what could change that? Of course, as Kristine suggested, some sort of statement that puts into question the U.S. commitment to NATO and the U.S. value, the U.S. Belief that NATO is a valuable institution. We could also see some sort of statement that creates economic difficulties when we're at the G7, because I agree, this will be the end of the trip. Trump will be tired. And I'm not quite sure that the president's going to be able to escape the controversy that's happening on this side of the Atlantic.
Kristine, with all the whirlwind and turmoil that is going on at home for the U.S. president, how does he show that he's capable of executing a coherent and a reasonable foreign policy that his allies will be looking for?
The way he would do that is by showing respect to the various people he will meet. When talking about the Brussels portion, he will be meeting the new president of France, Emmanuel Macron. He will be going to see the presidents Juncker and Tusk of the European Union before seeing the NATO leaders. And so the way that he can show consistency and stability in the United States foreign presence is by doing a solid handshake, committing the United States to continuing in various productive ways in the relationships it already has, in trade, in intelligence, and in the fundamental values that both Europe and the United States espouse. And so if he is able to be steady through that and have polite, dignified meetings, then the U.S. will be on a good footing, or a better footing than it would otherwise be.
All right. Thanks to all my guests, Joseph Kechichian, Kristine Berzina, and Mark Jacobson. And thank you for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From myself and the whole team here in Doha, goodbye for now.